Hello and welcome to this review of my Corsair K60 RGB keyboard. First review of the year. I got sent this by Corsair in late 2020 when I mentioned to one of their PR guys that I'm interested in non-MX stuff, and they offered to send me this one which uses Cherry Viola instead, and since I'd had quite a few requests for a Viola review, I figured this would be a cool thing to cover. Viola are the modern replacement to Cherry's MY series of switches, which were marketed as a low-cost alternative to Cherry's more well-known MX series. This is what MY switches look like. Essentially, they're a leaf spring over membrane design with clip-in modules and a captive coil spring to provide the return force. There have been 3 iterations of the design with some small changes along the way, but they all work in the same manner. Essentially, when you push down on the slider, it presses on the leaf spring, which hinges a small portion and presses on the membranes underneath through this little kink here, registering a key press. It's a simple mechanism and actually makes the same MTBF as Cherry MX at 50 million key presses per key. The only problem with the design is that it sucks giant rhinoceros cocks. It's incredibly stiff. Someone measured it at around 120 grams at bottom out, and it feels like absolute dog shit. It has a terrible tendency to bind on off-center key presses too, which is why I gave it the 4th place in my top 10 worst switches video, where it beat the likes of Stackpoles, Amstrads, Futaba ML, and Keytronic Foam and Foil, among several other irredeemable cunt biscuits. An interesting side effect of the 2-spring arrangement that it uses is that its force curve isn't completely linear but instead progressive, i.e. it gets stiffer faster along the key travel, which is why it feels rather light at the beginning of the key press but very stiff at the bottom. Anyway, on to Cherry Viola, which are kind of the same thing except completely different in every way. Perhaps the most notable difference is that they don't use a membrane but instead use a double-pronged leaf spring that shorts a circuit on the PCB. Here you can see one of the modules. It's very simple, just a 4-piece clip-in design. The slider is also the top housing, and you can see that the leaf spring is a very different design, and in fact they weren't made to do the same thing, so that makes sense. The shorting bit at the end is all curly. In fact, one of the prongs is actually a double curl for some reason, and it's bent into a 180-degree semicircle, making this very similar in look to the click leaf from Monterey switch. You'll also note that these switches are lubricated out of the factory, but for some reason they put it on the contact leaf, which is kind of weird because you wouldn't think that this part would cause any friction. And I doubt whether it's an electrolyte, because in all likelihood that would seriously mess up the sensing properties of the switch. The fact that they're clip out and not soldered to anything does mean that these switches are actually hot swappable. Although you obviously can't drop a different switch type in there, it's only hot swappable with other Viola switches. Still, it does make replacing a faulty switch, or even just maintaining them, a lot easier. So, how do they feel? Well, it's kind of interesting. It's very different from MY actually. Well, thankfully. First of all, they made the switches a lot lighter. It starts off at around 35 grams and slowly ramps up to 45 halfway, which is when it actuates, so similar to Cherry MX Red. But like MY, it's actually progressive, so after 2mm it ramps up more steeply to 75 grams, which is closer to the bottom-out force of Cherry MX Black. Cherry themselves refer to the progressive nature as cross-linear, whatever that's supposed to mean. Anyway, it's a rather mixed bag because it means that it actuates rather easily. Every once in a while it fired accidentally because of the weight of my fingers, but it bottoms out more like a mid-weight switch. Smoothness-wise, it's a major improvement over Cherry MY, that much is immediately obvious. But how does it hold up against actual MX switches? Well, to test that, I've got another Corsair here, this K70 with MX Reds in fact. Now, I'd say that this is actually smoother and it binds slightly less too. The difference isn't huge, but in a blind test I'd probably end up preferring the Violas, which is not something I was expecting to be honest. But it's not as smooth as a good contactless switch, but still, it's impressive, I have to give it that. One thing that's particularly noteworthy about the switch is that it comes with absolutely off-the-chart spring ping, perhaps a non-surprising trait of a leaf spring switch. It's rather bizarre though, it sounds like a ping master. Listen to this. For reference, here's an actual ping master by the way. Okay, ping mass is still worse, but still, it's really bad. Overall, they're slightly smoother than MX Red, but I prefer the weighting of MX Reds because I think making a switch stiffer only to bottom out, it doesn't really add anything, it just makes it more annoying. I think they also don't sound quite as good. But I'm not disappointed with the Switch overall, considering it was conceived as a budget option and only consists of 4 parts. The build quality of the keyboard is not bad. The plastic parts are pretty flimsy, but it's nicely held together by the trademark Corsair brushed aluminium top plate, and it weighs only 816 grams, or about 1.77 of King Richard's poops in imperial units, which isn't that much for a full-size keyboard, but it's remarkably rigid. It doesn't flex much at all. Look at this, which again rather surprised me, so it's pretty good for a budget keyboard, I'd say. The look of the keyboard is rather budget too, with remarkably few bells and whistles. Compared to the more mid-budget K70, and especially the top-of-the-line K100, it looks positively Spartan. But the irony is, I don't think it looks the worst, quite the opposite. I think I still prefer the look of the K70 with these upstanding edges here, which is pretty nice in my opinion, but I really like the simplistic look of the K60 too, especially that of the logo, which is 1,000 times better than any of the others. I'd say if they replaced this logo on the K70 with the simplistic one on the K60 and stuck it on the top left somewhere here, it'd be pretty perfect. One negative thing about the features that I actually like is the absence of a pass-through port, because this leads to a much thinner and, more importantly, more pliable cable. The K70s has the advantage of being braided, but these thick pass-through cables are as thick and inflexible as rebar, and they tend to really get in the way. So that absence of that is actually something I like. Finally, another very obvious budget thing is the keycaps, which are thin laser-ablated ABS. Now, I don't mind ABS myself per se, but laser ablation isn't very durable, and it also gives keycaps these very slick surfaces that makes fingerprints and other smudges stand out like a sore thumb. But the worst thing is that they're these low-profile caps, which are very ugly, they don't provide adequate key spacing, and moreover make absolutely no sense on a full travel keyboard. So I'm not sure why they didn't even go for their normal full-height laser-ablated ABS caps. Apparently there is a Best Buy exclusive SE model which costs $10 more, and that does come with their normal double-shot PBT caps though. It comes with backlighting, of course, and unlike what I expected, it comes with key programmability through their awful IQ software package, although it doesn't have any dedicated macro keys like the K100 does. Now, one thing these switches have, which is also very common among semi-mechanical or dome with slider budget keyboards, is that the switches cause a tremendous amount of light bleed from under the keycaps. It's the white opaque nature of the housing that makes it light up so much, plus the entire slider is transparent. Now, I've said multiple times that it's actually pretty decent for a budget keyboard, and I stick to that. The only problem is, it doesn't cost as much as a budget keyboard, it's $90. That's more than twice the price of an average budget keyboard, and that's assuming that this thing comes with free shipping too. Not to mention that those other budget boards often come with non-budget switches, well, MX clones, so I think it's debatable how budget that is nowadays. Now, like I said, I don't think that these Viola switches are really worse than Cherry MX, just different. It has its own pros and cons, but I find the cost of this keyboard somewhat hard to justify. If they had it on for an actual budget price, it would make sense, or if they made it a proper premium keyboard for this money, it would make sense. But I feel like if this is what Corsair would consider a budget keyboard, perhaps they shouldn't be making one. Not that it's a bad product, I just think the pricing is a bit weird when looking at the bigger picture. Tell you what, here's an idea. Take this keyboard, make it look like a K70 with the logo of the K60, like I suggested, and put the optoelectric switches and keycaps from the K100 in that. Leaving off the useless extra crap from the K100 should save a lot of money, and that way you should get a competitively priced, great-looking keyboard with excellent switches and great keycaps. Then just move the actuation point down from 1 to 2 or at least 1.5 millimeters, and that's it. You're welcome, Corsair. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.